the suspect effectiveness of those systems, they are bound to have a psychological effect and give false sense of security to the Indians, and it will have a corresponding effect on the value of deterrence. Now, with this kind of profile of forces, particularly if you deploy a limited ballistic missile defense, the temptation to go first will always be very strong. To destroy as many systems of the other side of ground before they are launched against you, so that your ballistic missile defensive have to deal with the residual capability which is then left behind. So that temptation of first strike, and then it is not out of context that people just dismiss that, oh, it's former officials who have been talking about these things, but it was the Indian Defence Minister himself, Mr. Parikar, and then Shiv Shankar Menon, who was for many years the National Security Advisor, whose position was somewhat similar to the DGSPD's position in Pakistan. So once these people start talking about a move away from no first use and consideration of a first use preemptive kind of strategies in India, I think they have to be taken seriously. And if you, as I said, look at the background of the technologies which are coming up, they are going to lead towards that direction. In case of Pakistan, again, the deterrency policy remains credible minimum deterrence. But once you have introduced the battlefield weapons, which are basically counter military targets, counter force weapons, then you are moving away from minimum deterrence, which is basically a counter value retaliatory strategy, which is a deterrence by punishment model, as Mr. Bowens would also mentioned, that you are getting into the realm of deterrence by denial, which is the nuclear war fighting kind of model. So these kind of capabilities, whether you like it or not, with the MIRVs again coming up, which are again suitable against counter force targets rather than counter value targets. So once you have those tools with you, so the work you can do with those tools is specific to the capability of those tools. So there is bound to be a change, which I think we need to consider, discuss, debate, and see. To me, it appears that the current Pakistani doctrine, from whatever I see in the statements and whatever has come out in the public domain, is that it is closer to a graduated deterrence kind of strategy rather than minimum deterrence strategy. Because once you have short range weapons, and then you have slightly longer range weapons, and then you have medium range weapons, so you are going into a graduated deterrence kind of strategy. But I don't know, there is, it appears to me, I get a lot of criticism for this, but this is my personal understanding. I may be very well, I may be absolutely wrong, but my understanding is that there is a dichotomy between the declared policy and the actual posture on ground. Not only in case of Pakistan, but in India as well. But why we are reluctant to accept this change and announce a new strategy as the US has been doing? The example is in front of us. From massive retaliation, they went on to flexible response, and then to mutually assured destruction, to limited nuclear options, and then countervailing and prevailing strategy. So obviously, as I said, this is a natural evolutionary process, and we are going through that process because of the technology changes, because of the changes in the doctrines, operation convention doctrines. So there is bound to be a change in the nuclear doctrine, and why shouldn't we embrace that change and accept that this is the doctrine we now have? The problem with Pakistan is compounded because Pakistan's nuclear deterrence is aimed at deterring not only India's nuclear capability, but also because of India's clear advantage in convention forces to deter India's conventional aggression as well. And because of that factor, Pakistan's nuclear strategy remains sensitive to any changes in India's conventional strategy as well. And that is why we saw this this reaction to India's Gold Star doctrine, which was essentially a convention doctrine in terms of Pakistan's introduction of active nuclear weapons. So there is bound to be that relationship because of the objective, strategic objective of the nuclear policy. So in that context, I think we have to look at the doctrinal issues, and I am convinced that there is need to have a greater debate, and we need to relook at some of our concepts and have greater clarity, because one of the basic tenets of deterrence is that you need to have very clear communication. Yes, ambiguity does complicate the calculations of the other side, but clarity in the deterrence message is also very important. So I think that has to also be looked into. There was this mentioned by Mr. Desmond about opportunity cost. Obviously, we don't know the exact figures, but I can give you one pointer of opportunity cost and in fact, the benefit we have achieved from nuclear deterrence is that if you look at the defense budget of Pakistan in 1998 or 97, in terms of percentage of GDP, it was 5.6% or something. And if you look at it, the current percentage of GDP being assigned to defense, it is something like around 3.2% or something. So I think that is the dividend which we have got after the nuclearization, which has given us that cushion, and we are not, as was mentioned earlier, we are always conscious of the resource constraints, and we do not want to get into any economic difficulty by blindly going into an arms race. One more point before I close I would like to make. It was mentioned in the last session that to deter India, we need to be able to hit each and every target on the Indian soil, and whether it is on the mainland or in the island territory. I would like to remind you of the French example. They basically aimed at destroying Moscow. They said if we are able to destroy Moscow, our deterrence will be capable, will be effective and credible. And that concept of proportionate deterrence, where they said if they can kill us and we have the capability to chop off one of their arms or legs, our deterrence will still be effective. I think we need to look at deterrence in that context and look at the power of each and every nuclear weapon, the destructive power it carries. So we don't need to really compete with anybody's numbers or try to kill every living being and destroy every building structure on the other side to have deterrence. I think even if we are able to hit some of the major cities, that should deter. And as far as our experience goes, the deterrence worked in 2001, it worked in 2008. And I am sure it remains effective and credible. And that is why we see, because of the stability at the strategic level, that there is more of instability at the sub-convention level. That manifestation of that typical stability and stability paradox. Thank you.
Thank you. I think several arguments have come in. My sense of this presentation is that it fits in beautifully. The first one to try to give us a sense of how several issues have evolved. But the important takeaways are this is not where it is. It's continuous evolution was the sense that India and Pakistan started with, and perhaps when each side feels that it is consolidated, that thereabouts might be a plateau. Is that already there, or is it somewhere in the future? How distant is it? These kind of questions. Also, this issue of transparency versus opacity is something that is evolving. As long as the technologies are evolving, it might be issues that they might want to use. These are a couple of statements that one can think of. Now,
number one.
And in order to go to the next opinion, they are introduced Brigadier Badberry, IISS fellow for land warfare. And I should acknowledge that every time you speak, I'm reminded of my time in South College of how to bring out difficult ideas in the plainest kind of language. Mr. Berry is the IISS expert on higher management of defense, military strategy, operational tactics, military innovation and adaptation, border warfare, and focusing particularly on the land warfare. He does look at the defense and military analysis and ensures that the analysis given in the publication, especially the military balance, is very, very specific. Yes.
Can you hear me right at the back? We've just heard a very useful statement. What you do with the tools are specific to the nature of the task. Bear that in mind, because I'd like to very conclusion from the end of it. General Kidwine began with a very clear statement of his view of minimal equivalent deterrence, that it had effect at tactical, operational, strategic levels, and could have a counter-force, a counter-value, or a battlefield role. He also gave a very interesting assessment of the value that India would get if it spent the enormous sums of money, because ballistic missile defense does cost enormous sums of money. The value India would get from fielding ballistic missile defense, and his view was it would have very little utility because it wouldn't be very effective, and also we do know it would cost an awful lot. I plan at this stage in the afternoon to pose some serious questions that suggest much of the same argument applies to Pakistan's short-range, low-yield capability. Now, my credentials are that the first half of my career was when I was in the Cold War, and not only were officers of my generation steeped in education and training around nuclear deterrence, from the very strategic level to the prospective employment of land and air battlefield nuclear weapons in a war in Europe. And I think I'm possibly the only person in the room with that background, which is relevant to this scenario. Now, we can expect even now Pakistan's missiles, warheads, storage sites, dedicated nucleus, command control, and the excellent SPD force to be a high priority for Indian intelligence gathering, which would increase dramatically in the event of a crisis of war. So we could expect India to devote a high proportion of its intelligence assets to finding the capability, and once finding it, to striking. And once it moved, it would of necessity be unmasked and more vulnerable to detection and attack. And any successful conventional attack with a nuclear warhead would create a dirty hazard to Pakistan's own forces and to its civilians. And if it involves plutonium, don't forget it's one of those poisonous substances known to man. And the comparatively short range of the missiles mean that they must be launched very close to the front line, making them easier targets than if they were held at depth. So you could expect the Indian theatre and tactical level airland plans to attempt to do this with air ballistic, conventional ballistic missiles, long-range artillery, attack helicopters, air assault forces and special forces, as well as raiding columns of land forces. And that's just the offensive part of it. India might also choose to adapt their campaign plan and adjusting their tactics. You would expect them to increase their operational and tactical tempo to make your decision-making cycle more difficult. You would expect them to increase dispersion. You would expect them to hug you. Now that's a concept that has been employed by Chinese and North Koreans in the Korean War, the Vietnam and North Vietnamese in the Vietnam War, and successfully employed by the Taliban to counter NATO aircraft. It means getting up close as you can to the enemy, so it's more difficult to strike. And the much greater effect of nuclear weapons actually makes that a lot easier to do. And you can also expect them to get as close as they can to populated areas to make those difficult to engage with nuclear firepower. And in choosing their forces, you could expect them to increase specially tags the land weapon system with the greatest inherent protection against the range of effects of nuclear weapons. Alternatively, they could seek to discombobulate Pakistan after a short-range, low-yield strike by showing restraint. For example, if the military objective was to destroy the leading Indian armoured brigade, the most threatening armoured division, India might just say, well, that's bad luck for the 1st Brigade, pass the 2nd Brigade through and crack on. So by exercising restraint, it could gain sympathy from the international community and still maintain its momentum. And of course, India has the option to use strategic nuclear capabilities in a tactical fashion. You can have any number of pre-planned targets, tactical targets of strategic systems. And of course, it could choose to target important military targets or important economic targets that weren't cities, but which could profoundly damage Pakistan. But of course, Indian doctrine is still massive retaliation. And how confident could Pakistan be that India wouldn't do what they said they're going to do? And in the event of escalation, how certain could Pakistan be that its retaliation would destroy Indian second strike capabilities? And of course, in the medium and long term, India could choose to checkmate this Pakistani capability by developing their own short-range nuclear capability. My other contention is about the cost of the tools. Let me just do a quick tutorial. 1987, 1st British Corps in Germany, 3 small armoured divisions, a total strength of 55,000 troops in peacetime, had a couple of batteries of Lance missiles and some artillery batteries that were capable of firing 155 shells. That required 3 permanent bunkered storage sites, each of which was guarded by an infantry company. It required an ordnance battalion simply to manage the weapon. It required a 2nd dedicated security force. It also required dedicated highly redundant command and control and an independent inspectorate that validated all this was at the very high standards necessary. And on top of that, there was a NATO inspectorate as well. So effectively, a small armoured corps had forfeited an armoured brigade's worth of troops in order to have that nuclear capability. And it's not just physically having the force structure. There needs to be a way of protecting your own forces from the consequences of your own attacks. So there needs to be a highly capable, redundant, hardened command and control system to tell your troops when your own attacks are imminent. And you've got to protect your own troops from the weapon effects, and that includes flash, blast, heat, EMP, and radiation. And this has equipment and training implications, for example, issue of protective equipment and costs. Now, towards the end of the Cold War, and I'm talking here about the 1980s, much of the US and UK military leadership and military thinkers, including my peer group, were coming to the view that conventional weapons then in development could have effects on the enemy akin to that of tactical nuclear weapons. And without the additional costs, security requirements and command and control complications, not to mention the fallout, collateral damage and civilian casualty bills. And examples of these included precision bombs and missiles from aircraft, modern multiple launch rocket systems, which with both unguided and smart warheads could neutralise armoured targets over wide areas, and particularly attack helicopters. And for example, it's been repeatedly demonstrated by the US, for example, that a battalion of Apache helicopters can neutralise an armoured brigade, and you can use them again and again. So they actually have considerable utility. And of course, all of these have been enabled by modern intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance systems, of which drones and airborne radars are but a small part. And we've seen this in action. We saw it in action in an early version in Desert Storm in 1991. And it was vindicated by extraordinarily innovative US plans and operations to depose the Taliban in Afghanistan and to destroy Saddam Hussein's forces at the start of Operation Iraqi Freedom. The fact that both operations were grossly mishandled does not obscure that this model was made to work. And a recent example is in 2001, a Libyan government armoured battalion was near instantaneously destroyed by a few French aircraft when it was on its way towards Benghazi in Libya. And the French did a similar trick against a 2-battalion column of jihadis headed to Bamako in Mali in 2013. Now, there have been other developments since that greatly increased the effectiveness of conventional forces. For example, there's been a revolution in the application of precision guidance to mortars, artillery, and battlefield rockets. And this has been abundantly on display for those who want to see it in the US support provided to the Iraqi troops fighting in Mosul, where every single US and French artillery round that's gone into Mosul has had some form of guidance system. So my assessment, and obviously I understand why this is surrounded in operational security, and the full budgetary details won't be laid before the Finance Committee in Parliament. I quite understand that. But the funds that are being spent on short-range, low-yield weapons, and all the necessarily resource-intensive and excellent security support and command and control, are funds that cannot be spent on advanced conventional weapons and other military systems. And those other systems are not only usable in the unlikely scenario of a war of national survival, but they're also usable in operations against domestic insurgents and against TTP elements based in ungoverned states in Afghanistan that are attempting to get into Pakistan. And I confidently predict if a full audit was done of the cost of the short-range low-yield capability, and you then matched it against things like drones and advanced surveillance systems and all sorts of modern equipment usable in counterinsurgency and counter-terrorism, you will see that you have yourself forfeited a large amount of technology that can make a big difference in not only protecting Pakistan from insurgents and miscreants coming in from Afghanistan, but would also be of great assistance in stabilising, for example, the West, which you feel so vulnerable about in terms of its vulnerability to malicious Indian subversion. So, the opportunity cost of this capability has led to Pakistan's conventional forces having less capability, and it has increased India's conventional superiority and its forfeited capability that could make security and stability operations even now more effective, let alone greatly increasing the effectiveness of border protection of the excellent Pakistani troops who shoulder the considerable burden in UN peacekeeping operations worldwide. So, my conclusion, which I've deliberately set out to be inconvenient and uncomfortable, is the tools you've created are expensive